Hello, good morning. Today is January 20th, 2022. Lots of twos and zeros in there. It's our privilege here today with this episode of Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour, to be talking with Rho Thomas. But before we get into that, of course, with the Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour, as many of you know, this was started in May of 2020 in response to the pandemic, where marvelous colleagues give a presentation of some sort, and we ask that those who hear it, listen to it later, watch the video, participate, if you could be so kind as to make a donation to a food bank, either of your own choice or of the speaker's choice. And basically, I look at this as feed your mind while feeding the world. So at this point, how much is it, Jeff, that we know of, that Natalie's been told about, that of donations that have been made?
Thank you, Jean. Our wonderful audiences worldwide have been so generous with food banks. I'm very proud to say that our audiences have so far contributed $230,468 to fight food insecurity worldwide. Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, our generous audiences, you, Natalie, Sarah. Back to you, Jean. Thank you.
That is so fantastic. I say we're coming up on $250,000. That's 2 to 3 million meals. And that's just what we know about, of course. I'm sure there have been plenty of donations that we don't have the numbers in that tally. So anyway, thank you so much for your generosity. So moving to today's speaker, a very interesting topic and a bit of a different one. We have Rho Thomas with us. She is an attorney who, after practicing about 7 years in big law at Kirkpatrick Townsend in Atlanta, she decided to take the plunge and leave the practice of law as such, and is a, money
coach.
Thank you. Okay,
yes.
money guru, baby. Basically helping lawyers, professionals, anybody really who, helping people, let's just put it that way, to master their money, to create their freedom, and be able to make choices in your life and not be tied to money or the need of money or the bills that you have or the like. So with that, I think that I would just recommend that it's so worth checking out Rho's LinkedIn and her podcast. They're very interesting. And there's a lot that can resonate with what she has to say. So she's here today to help us. And her food bank is, let's see, what is it? The Greater Atlanta Food Bank, is it?
Yep, the Atlanta Community Food Bank, yes.
The Community Food Bank. Okay, Natalie will put that in the chat so that you can all know where that is for your generous donations. And then Rho, why don't I turn it over to you? The floor is yours. Tell us about your food bank and then tell us about money.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. I shared earlier this week on my LinkedIn that I actually experienced food insecurity some when I was younger. And so it's just such an honor to be able to support this organization because it is an important issue. So kudos to you all for the work that you're doing. As Jean mentioned, my name is Rho Thomas. I am a money coach here in Atlanta, and I am supporting the Atlanta Community Food Bank. So if you would be so kind as to support those who are experiencing food insecurity here in Atlanta, I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure that they would as well. So I've got a presentation for you today. It's called How to Be Better with Money. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I can't. Zoom has frozen on me. It's not allowing me to see the screen. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, there it is. So I don't know if I'm going to try that one more time. It froze when I tried to share, but hopefully it will still allow me to show my presentation. All right. All right, I think that worked.
That works.
So we are talking today about how to be better with money. Before we get into all of the materials, again, my name is Rho Thomas. I'm a money coach for lawyers. I help lawyers master their money and create freedom and choice in their lives. I've been coaching for about 4 years. And as Jane mentioned, I recently left the practice of law. I practiced trademark law for about 7 years. And in September, I left to go full-time on my money coaching and helping those who are struggling with money. I also fairly recently finished paying off about $500,000 of student loan debt with my husband. For those who aren't familiar with my story, back in 2016, I had my first child. I was headed back to work at the beginning of 2017, and I was thinking about taking advantage of our firm's reduced hours policy, where you could, do a percentage of your hours for a percentage of your salary. But when we looked at our finances, we realized that that wouldn't be feasible for us because we had over $670,000 of debt and a negative $342,000 net worth. And so we started looking into what we needed to do to pay off debt, to manage our money better, all of that. And over the last 5 years, we paid off the student loans, which was almost $500,000. And all we have left is our mortgage now, which is about 180, 190,000, something like that. So this is something that I've really lived. And that's why I'm so passionate about helping others do it, because I have experienced the freedom that comes with having better control of your money, not feeling like you're drowning in debt, not knowing what you're doing. So what we are talking about today, we're going to talk about the 4 main areas that you can clear up to start managing your money better. The first one is your mindset. And I think the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we think about money, the way that we think about money skills is huge. Like I say all the time, 80 to 90% of personal finance is your thoughts. It's the way that you're thinking about things. And then on top of that, it's the skills like budgeting, like paying off your debt, like saving, investing, all of that. So we're going to first hit the mindset piece, and then we're going to talk about overspending, how a lot of lawyers have a lack of awareness around where their money is going currently, what they're spending, whether they like what they're spending on, all of that. We'll hit debt, because a lot of times we have student loan debt, often it's 6-figure student loan debt, and we don't know what we're doing with it. And so we're going to talk about, the plan for paying off your debt. I'll talk about my favorite plan, the one that my husband and I actually use, the one that I teach my clients. And then finally, we're going to touch on savings and investing. Like that's one of the things that, often we know that we should do, but we don't put a plan in place for it. We don't actually start doing it. So let's talk about mindset. Mindset is everything. As I mentioned, 80 to 90% of personal finance, I think, is our mindset. So often when, we're talking about money, like we think that the issue is like, oh, we just don't make enough. If I brought in more money, then I'd be able to make progress on my debt or my saving or whatever it is. We think we just need more willpower, right? More accountability to be able to hit these goals. Or we think we just haven't found the right tool yet. We don't have the right budget. We don't have the right debt payment strategy, the right savings account, whatever it is. None of those things are actually the problem. The problem is the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we think about money, the way that we think about our money skills, right? So I think often, like our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors are all connected. And so like when you have, thoughts about things, like you have these opinions, the way that you view things, it influences the way that you feel about them, the way that you act, all of that. And that sets off this chain reaction where, you have a certain thought. So for instance, about money, right? And then you feel a certain way. Often our thoughts about money are negative, so then we feel negative about it, and then we avoid it. We don't want to look at the bank account. We don't want to look at the debt, that kind of thing. And so then ultimately we end up staying in the same place, not making progress, and think that money is hard. We think that we can't do it, right? So I want to get into some specific thoughts that I see with my clients about themselves. So, lawyers often will think, I'm just not good with money. Like, that whole joke that you went to law school because you're not good at math, right? You don't like numbers. I don't know how to do this. I'll never figure this out, or I should know how to do this by now. All of these just really bad feeling thoughts that, like, you're beating yourself up and you are like not feeling encouraged about your money. And then it leads to you not looking at it, not trying to make progress, all of that, right? You're never going to get positive results from negative thinking. The same is true about money and money skills. So we think money is too complicated. I don't want to be deprived. Like, to be better with money, you've got to be deprived. You've got to be on a strict budget, right? We think that making a budget is too time consuming or it's too tedious, so we just don't do it. Or we think this won't work. Like, maybe you've tried things in the past and you're like, oh, well, all these strategies, they just don't work. But when you have those types of thoughts going on, then you're not going to take the steps that you need to take to achieve whatever your goals are. So I want to show you an example of what I'm talking about. So I mentioned that your thoughts, your emotions, your behaviors are all tied together, and they lead to the outcomes that you get in your life. There is a woman named Brooke Castillo who runs the Life Coach School, and she has this really effective tool called the self-coaching model that shows, like, really lays out how the interconnection works. And so in her tool, she says the C, that's your circumstance, that's just the things that happen in the world, right? So I put here money, right? Things that are out in the world that exist, money, other people, whatever it is. Then we have thoughts, the T, about that neutral circumstance, that thing that happened out in the world, that thing that exists. So the thought I chose here is I'm not good with money, because that tends to be the really common one that comes up for so many people. When you're thinking that thought, it leads to a particular emotion or feeling. So F stands for feeling. For me, if I'm thinking I'm not good at this, I'm not good with money, I feel defeated, right? So then what actions do you take when you're feeling defeated? Well, I'm definitely not going to go looking at my money, right? I'm not going to go look at my bank account. I am not creating a budget. Maybe I'm running up my credit cards higher than I typically would because I'm not looking at what I'm spending. I might also just get into even more debt, right? Or not save. All of these different things that you might be doing when you're feeling defeated. And then the result is that you end up not being, quote, good with money. And I put good in quotation marks there because that is still an opinion, right? That's still a thought, but you've got the evidence there where, like, I didn't save anything this month. Maybe I overdrafted my account because I wasn't paying attention to how much was in there. I ended up going further into debt, right? All of these things that we think are not good with money. And then it's like, oh, well, see, I'm just not good with money. I knew it. And then it starts the loop all over again. So if you have any of those thoughts that I talked about, whether about yourself, about money skills, it's completely normal. Like, that happens a lot. It comes up a lot. And so I just want you to be mindful of it, to notice when you're thinking that you can't do it or that you're not good with money or whatever else, because I could tell you all the strategy in the world, but if you think it won't work, or you think you're just bad at money, or you think you can't do it, you can't do it, then you're not going to do it. You're not going to apply the strategies to get the results that you're looking for with your money. All right, so now getting into some of the strategies and these other areas, like if you look at the 4 areas that we talked about, mindset is kind of like the overarching theme, right? It runs through all of the areas, but I wanted to talk about it separately because it is the most important. But overspending is a big issue as well. So I talk to a lot of lawyers who are overspending and they're able to cover their bills. They're, buying lots of things that they want, spending on things that they want, but then they're not achieving their money goals, right? They don't have money to show for the income that they are bringing in. They don't have much in savings. Maybe they haven't made much of a dent in their student loans. It's really easy for your expenses to grow to fill your income when you're not being intentional about how you're spending. And so often we get more income, we get raises, we get bonuses, things like that. And rather than saving more, we tend to spend more. And there's this great graphic that I love that talks about how we typically handle increases in our income. And you see here, the green line is our income and the blue line is our needs. And as our income increases, these things that we think we need also increase, right? Things that were once wants become needs. And then your savings also increases a little bit, but it's just not the same. So I think that this graphic is really helpful in illustrating the way that we tend to manage our money, because when you are thinking that you need this thing, it's easy to justify that you're going to spend on that thing, right? Wealth is built in the gap between your income and your expenses. But for so many people, that gap either doesn't exist or it's very tiny. And I quote these statistics all the time, but 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, including 25% of households that make $150,000 or more. So, when people are spending so much, they don't have that extra money left over in their budget, then they're not able to use that money to pay off debt, to save, to invest, to build wealth. And so I say that the solution is to create a budget so that you know where your money is going, right? Not having a budget really hinders your ability to build wealth because you don't know where your money's going. If you don't know where it's going, then you can't direct it to where you want it to go. So I teach the zero-based budget, but there are lots of different types of budgets out there. The point is to decide where your money is going ahead of time, right? So with the zero-based budget, if you're bringing in, say, $8,000 in a month, then you're going to use $8,000. And that is for whatever the categories are, right? For your bills, for things that you want to buy, for your goals, etc. And at the beginning of the month, you want to write down how much you expect to bring in and how much you expect to spend in your different categories. And then at the end of the month, you're going back through and looking at how much you actually spent. And now, just to be clear, the end of the month is not the only time. The end of the month is not the only time that you're looking at how much you're spending. You want to be tracking it throughout the month as well. So, at the end of the month, you look at how much you actually brought in, how much you actually spent, and make sure that it lines up, right? When you're first starting out with creating a budget, if you don't have a budget at all, you have not looked at this before, then you want to do a 3-month look back, or at least a 1-month look back. You want to have a good basis for creating a budget, so you're not just pulling numbers out of thin air. If you are using the numbers that you actually have, right, your actual spending, then you're going to create a more realistic budget that you're more likely to stick to, versus I typically spend $500, on groceries, and I arbitrarily chose $100, and now I'm beating myself up because I'm going over my grocery budget. Well, $100 wasn't a realistic grocery budget, right? Right? So that's something to keep in mind. And that's why I teach to do a look back, so that you make sure that you are creating a budget that will actually work for you. And then you also want to be mindful of your values and make sure that those things that are important to you, you're making room for them in your budget. Another thing with your values, when you're doing that look back, is look at where you're spending money on things that you don't care about, right? Because if you're spending unintentionally, you're not really paying attention to it, then you probably are spending way more than you expect on things that you don't care a whole lot about. So just being mindful of your spending and tying it to your values as best you can is going to be super helpful for you. I also, before I move on here, want to talk to anyone who, like me, might be the first in your family to be a lawyer, or my husband is the first in his family to be a doctor. And I think it's really important to make sure that you are setting yourself up financially before you try to help other people. And that's not to say that you have to completely pay off all of your debt and have all of the savings and whatever else. But often I think because you might feel that pressure, like you're the one who made it, you feel like you have to like help other people, and you're trying to do all of this to help other people, but you're doing it at the expense of your own finances and your own financial progress. So the way that I teach my clients who are in this situation, and what we have actually done, is you create a budget for yourself of how much you're going to contribute to family things, right? And it could be for a month, it could be for the year, but you just want to make sure that you are tracking how much you are helping your family so that you're not putting yourself in a worse position trying to help. Because it's so much easier to help when you are in a good financial position yourself. If you're struggling, you're not going to be able to help in the same way that you would be able to once you are on solid financial ground. So just wanted to put that out there, and that's something like a consideration in your budget. Make sure that you are paying attention to the amount that you are contributing to your family, choosing an amount that's not going to put your financial progress at risk, because you're going to be able to help so much more once you get yourself on a solid financial ground. All right, so a few resources to help with budgeting. I have the exact budget template that I use, like my husband and I still use to this day, and that I give to all of my clients. You can find that at rhothomas.com/budget. And also episode 17 of my podcast, I went through like breaking down how to use that budget template to create your zero-based budget. So rhothomas.com/17, you can find that podcast episode also in your podcast player. All right, so let's talk about debt. I think that is the big thing for a lot of lawyers. We tend to come out with six-figure, multi-six-figure student loan debt, and it's like, I don't know what to do with this, right? The main thing is you want to make a plan. And that's not to necessarily say that like you have to pay off all of your debt immediately. Some people decide that they just want to hit the high interest rate debt and they let the lower interest rates ride while they tackle other financial goals. Maybe it's investing or, whatever it is. But ultimately it's personal preference, right? Just keep in mind that the power of compound interest works against you the longer that you keep the debt, especially when you're talking about higher interest rate debts. So the two main debt payment plans that people use, the debt snowball and the debt avalanche, don't ask me why they're both related to snow, have no idea. But with the debt snowball, you're paying off your debts from smallest to largest balance without regard to interest rate. The debt avalanche, you're paying off your debts from largest to smallest interest rate without regard to the balance. So these are the two most popular plans. I prefer the debt snowball, right? I used it personally. It's the method that I teach my clients. And I think it's the better of the two because of the ability to get quick wins, right? So going back to my own example, I mentioned to you that we were in over $670,000 of debt. Like the smallest loans were $1,500, $2,000, $2,500. And so we were able to pay off those small ones really quickly, right? And we were getting these quick wins where like at one point we were paying off a loan a month and we're getting these paid in full letters. And it's like, oh man, like we can do this, right? It's like you are like getting that opportunity to celebrate early. And as you get to 5-figure loans, 6-figure loans, you've got so much momentum behind you and so much evidence that you can do it that it doesn't feel as daunting, right? And then also, like I really encourage you to celebrate along the way. And you have those early, often opportunities to celebrate when you're paying off your debts from smallest balance to largest balance, and you're acknowledging like this accomplishment that you've done. If you're like me, right, and many lawyers, I think, it's like you accomplish something, it's like check on to the next. This allows you to like slow down and really acknowledge that you've done something amazing, right? You're doing it, you're accomplishing your goal. Take that time and really acknowledge what you've done. And one way that we did it, one small thing that we did, we had all of our debts on a spreadsheet and we had them in that order from smallest to largest. And as we paid off a debt, then we would highlight that line in green. And so then over time, you just see the green start taking over the page. And we just like reflect on, man, just, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, it was only this many things that were green. And now look at where we are, right? So like that is something where you are reinforcing like the amazingness of what you're doing as you're accomplishing your goals. Couple of resources to help you here as well. The repayment spreadsheet that we used, I offer that at rhothomas.com/debt tracker. And then also episode 25 of my podcast talks about the benefits of the debt snowball method. All right, the final area we're going to talk about today is saving and investing. So first off, emergency funds. Many lawyers don't have emergency funds and don't really think about it. It's like one of those things where it's like, oh, I'll get to that later. I'm going to do that. But it's not something that you want to put off for later, right? With saving for an emergency fund or investing. With your emergency fund, I think the amount that you keep depends on your personal situation, your risk tolerance, whether it's a single income household or a dual income household, or those types of things. There are people who will do a single month. There are people who will do a full year worth of expenses. Standard advice is 3 to 6 months of expenses, but it's personal to you. You get to choose what you want to do. The main thing is make sure that you've got enough so that if something were to happen, you're able to cover the expense. And when you talk about, the 3 to 6 months or the 1 month or the 1 year, that's not necessarily 3 to 6 months of your current expenses or a year of your current expenses. In an emergency situation, you're probably not going to be spending on all the things you're spending on right now, right? So it's the really important, kind of bare bones, these things must get paid. So that is what you want to use to base your emergency fund on. You want to be in a very boring, unsexy account. Sometimes people will try to invest their emergency funds because they want to get a return and that kind of thing. But that's not necessarily what you want to do with an emergency fund, because although you could get a greater return, investments are also they involve risk. And you don't want your emergency fund to be cut in half at the time that you need it the most, right? So I say put it in a boring, regular savings account, making the 0.01% or whatever the interest rates are now, because you want that money to be there, right? You don't want to worry about whether you're going to have your full emergency fund or not. And now we'll talk about investing just a bit. I don't give specific investment advice, but I do want to touch on this area because it is important. You don't only want to use savings accounts, you want to invest your money because your money can earn interest. So we talked about compound interest working against you when you're holding debt. Compound interest works for you when you're investing. You're able to earn more money on your money, right? So the easiest place to get started with investing is in the stock market, especially through your retirement accounts, like your 401k, your IRA, TSP, 403b, all of those types of accounts, whatever you have available at work. And if you are working for an employer that offers a match, which means you put in X percentage of your salary into your 401k or your retirement account, and they will give you money up to whatever that percentage, they will match what you've put in, then you want to at least put in enough to get that match. Otherwise, you're leaving free money on the table. So look into whether your employer offers a match if you're not sure, and make sure that you are investing enough to get that match. Beyond your retirement accounts, there are other things that you can invest in, there are taxable accounts, which just means that when you put money into those accounts, it's money that you're paying taxes on currently, versus in a retirement account, many of them are tax advantaged, where you put the money in right now tax-free and you won't pay taxes on it until you take it out in retirement. Of course, there's real estate, all kinds of things that you can invest in. The main thing that you want to think about when you're talking about investing is that you understand your investment. So it's not oh, my uncle told me about this hot stock tip, so I'm going to invest in this thing. Make sure that you understand it, because when you don't, that's how you end up getting into risky things that maybe you should not have invested in, right? That you end up, like when you hear those horror stories of people losing all of their money and things like that, it's probably because they didn't understand what they were investing in. So just make sure that whatever you decide to invest in, whether it's the stock market through a retirement account or a taxable brokerage, or it's real estate, or like, these other things that are coming out like Bitcoin and all of that, just make sure that you understand it. I wanted to hammer home like this illustration of investing your money and how it can help you versus just investing or just putting money into a savings account. So I ran a couple of calculations and I said, start it with $0 and said I invest $1,000 a month for 5 years with an 8% return, which is pretty average for the stock market. If you were to do that, you would have put in $60,000, but you would end up with just under $75,000. The exact amount was $73,966.70. That is the power of compound interest working in your favor, right? And now if you were to keep that up for 10 years, you would have put in $120,000, but you'd end up with over $180,000. It was $184,165.88. So you can see the power of investing and allowing your money to earn money for you versus only putting it into a savings account. You still do want to have money in a savings account that's right there, easily, like readily available, that's not subject to the fluctuations of the stock market. But beyond that, you do want to invest your money because you will be able to grow it so much better that way versus putting money into a savings account. And now, as I mentioned, I don't give investment advice. So if you're at the stage where you're thinking about your investments, you don't want to do it yourself, you can reach out to a financial advisor. I just do want to give you a few notes as you do that. And if you're not there yet, just keep this whole investing discussion in your back pocket. You will get there. Like doing the things that we talked about earlier in the presentation, you will absolutely get to this point where you are ready to invest. But notes on financial advisors. When you're choosing a financial advisor, I think the biggest thing is to think about how they are compensated. Some financial advisors have conflicts of interest where their compensation is based on commissions. So they might have an incentive to put you into investments that would pay a higher commission versus, something else that might be more right for you, but maybe pays a lower commission. So that's something to think about. That's not to say that people are definitely doing that, but there is that conflict of interest there. If you decide that you want to work with a financial advisor, I recommend a fee-only advisor, which means that they charge you a set fee and their compensation isn't tied at all to the specific investments that they're recommending that you choose. There are fee-based advisors, which sounds similar, but it's a little bit different because fee-based advisors still offer products that are commission-based. So I recommend, again, the fee-only advisors, and you want one who acts as a fiduciary, which, as you know, means that they have to act in your best interest. All right, so that is the presentation. If you want to take this work deeper, you want to apply this work to your specific finances, please feel free to reach out to me. When we work together, we develop your specific goals. We go through, how you can achieve them. I work with you through any mindset issues, help you evaluate, change course if you need to. And then of course, celebrate all of the achievements, all the progress that you make along the way. So if you're interested in that, you can head to rhothomas.com/call and we can talk about where you are now, where you want to be, and how we can work together to get you there. And if you're not ready, I would still love to connect with you. You can find me on my website at rhothomas.com. You can come connect with me on LinkedIn. I've got the link there. And then also on Instagram as well. And I've got the link for my Instagram. All right, so are there any questions? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see.
Right. That's fascinating. Thank you so much. What do we have here? We have a couple of people saying thank you to you in the chat.
Oh, you are welcome.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have questions, but I do have a couple first to start with, if I might. You know, you talked about leaving big law. And so no matter what level you are in big law, you are being paid, not you personally, but the people, you know, being paid decently, and then partners and all. And then you also talked about how as your income grows in that nice chart, you know, how your wants become needs, and it all just grows exponentially. And I find I have found with so many lawyers and just in talking with them over the years that you know, you can get stuck at a certain point because you always are counting on your draw coming in if you're a partner at that point, or your salary, your paycheck, whatever it might be. And yet, especially if you're a partner, you may not get that same draw every month, you know. What about partners? And that's when you get that draw, you have to pay your own taxes and you have to do that up front. And so many people don't really have that discipline to do that, you know, that it just becomes a real quagmire. And then you are stuck, or you can be stuck where you can't retire or you can't do something else if you really wanted to.
Yeah, so I think if I understand your question correctly, you're saying like, what about partners or maybe others who don't bring in a set income each month? Like, what should they be doing? Is that right?
Well, just anything, you know, I mean, when you deal with people who would like to do something else, to leave their practice, or you know, any professional really, that or self-employed type of person, you know,
Yeah.
suggestions you would have there for them on how to get unstuck so that they then have the freedom to make choices and do what they want, whereas they're not a slave to having to have that income come in and keep doing what they may or may not want to do, because they feel like they have to do it.
Gotcha. So I think the first step for everyone is to get that awareness of where you're spending currently, and then make sure that you like where you're spending, especially, you know, as you're talking about with someone who might be considering a change. Like, do I want to spend, like, would I rather spend on this thing, continue to spend this much here, or would I rather have more of that flexibility, right? And it's like really considering your expenses from that lens, like through that lens, versus just this is how I've always lived. Do you want to live that way, right? Like, is it worth it to you to stay in this particular situation, or, you know, do you want to have a different situation? Are you willing to let go of or reduce or whatever this expense to be able to get there? And then as far as having the fluctuating income, I'm going to answer that question that I thought that you were asking. I think it's still kind of tied to what you're saying. But when you have fluctuating income, I say to look at the lowest amount that you consider, like that you would bring in, and base your budget off of that. Like, don't depend on, you know, I need my income to be up here if sometimes it's down here, right? So use that amount as your budget. And then as you bring in more, right, in the months that you bring in more, then you can do, you know, a little bit more with it. Make sure that you are saving in those months. Like if you've got the, I think they call it like hills and valleys, like in those hill months, right, make sure that you're setting aside so that when you get to the valley months, you're not struggling and waiting until, you know, you get to another hill.
Yeah, that's for sure. Hills and valleys, maybe. Thank you. Do any of you have questions? Jeff?
Yeah, so Rho, some people are probably sitting out there thinking, well, you know, there's, I'm not the only one involved here. I've got a spouse, I've got kids, they have needs. Sometimes in a couple, people may not view money the same way or may come from different kinds of family upbringings. We're in the business of conflict resolution here. A lot of us are mediators. And what advice do you give people when you see that sort of difference in perspective in couples, or one member of the couple wants help and the other member sees things differently? How do you handle those situations?
Yeah, so that is super common, Jeff. And I think the key is not to attack it from the like, this is what we have to do. And I'm going to speak from my own personal experience of making this mistake, coming to my husband, like, we need to do this and we can't spend on this and we need to do that. Do you see all this debt? Blah, blah, right? Like coming at it from like all of this, what we have to do and what we can't do, versus when I took a step back and started talking to him about, and it wasn't until I was really looking at like what I wanted our life to be like after we had our first child, because I had been talking about wanting to pay off debt before we ever, even got pregnant with our first kid. And that was what we need to do. We got to do this and blah, blah, blah. I read this book, all of that. But having our first child helped me to put it into perspective where it's like, this is what I envision for our life, for us with our kids. Like, what is it that you see, right? Kind of dreaming together about what we want life to look like. And then from that approach, being able to say like, well, what would help us to get there? Well, it would help if we didn't have $670,000 of debt. Like maybe we could do something about that. And kind of looking at what he wanted, what I wanted, where we could meet in the middle. And then from there, kind of problem solve about how we can get to this vision that we see for our lives. So that's the way that I encourage couples to treat their money conversations. Like, don't talk at your partner and talk about this is what we have to do. And if you wouldn't spend on blah, blah, we used to get into so many disagreements about spending. Like, I like beauty products and, things like that. And he was always spending all this money on coffee and I don't care about coffee, right? So it's like, if you would stop spending on the coffee, it's like, well, if you wouldn't buy another lipstick, right? Like, instead of doing all of that, this is what I see. Like, I envision us being able to go to our kids' games and not in the back of our minds thinking about like, oh, I still need to bill all of this, I still have to do this. And so that was really helpful. And then on the like specific front about like disagreements on paying for different things that the other doesn't value, something that has been a game changer in my marriage is for us each to have, for lack of a better word, an allowance. So we each get this set amount. And it's no questions asked money. You can go spend it on all the coffee, all the, whatever else you want. And I'm going to buy my shoes and my, the things that I care about that you don't care about. And there's no questions asked, right? And so having that money where you're not like looking and kind of scrutinizing each other's finances and like what you're spending on and blah, blah, blah has been really helpful. So I always encourage my clients who are in partnerships to do that type of thing.
Ro, I've got a question for you. There are some of us on this call who are old enough to have lost substantial amounts of money when things crashed in 2008. And it left some of us a little gun shy. Not a lot of trust left in some of these institutions. How do you help those of us who have trust issues come back to the markets and invest and feel like it's a good decision for us?
Yeah, so I think for people who have had that situation, like there have been we talked about hills and valleys with income, lots of hills and valleys with the stock market as well. And one thing that I do is encourage you to look at the returns of the stock market over time, where like, yes, it's had like huge drops and, big leaps and whatever else, but over time it's always going up. And it's like, yes, if you can stay the course, right? Like there are some people who in 2008 were like, hey, the stock market's on sale and like continued to put money in, even though it felt really uncomfortable. But I think looking at the fact that, yes, the stock market is going to drop. That's part of the way that it works, right? That's part of why you're able to get higher returns because there is that risk involved. But over time, it always goes up. And so if you keep going, keep staying the course, then eventually it turns back and you continue to build. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Okay.
I suppose, Natalie, there are those who say when there's the big drops. And if you have dividend stocks, then with those dividends, you're buying more shares every, quarter than you would have
Exactly.
otherwise. So at the end, maybe that's good too. I don't know. Skip Royals, you have a question? You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I have a quick question on the fiduciary. So how do you determine if they are actually a fiduciary? So the fee-based, all that makes sense. However, I've never walked into an investment office and has fiduciary like plastered on the front window. So
Yes.
how do I go about determining that?
You would just ask them. Like I would ask, do you act as a fiduciary for your clients? And often the ones who do will give you a fiduciary agreement. Like they would give it to you in writing. It would help if they just had it on the window. Yeah. Yes, we are fiduciaries. We help.
That's very interesting because, I would think that everybody in that realm should be a fiduciary. So I just didn't know if there was a way to decipher. So that's all I was thinking.
It would be helpful if they were, but they aren't all. And as I mentioned, some like the way that they make their money is through commissions. And that's not to say that, everyone who works off commission is dishonest and is going to put you in, investments that aren't helpful, but just be aware that there is a conflict of interest there. And so look for ones that have the fiduciary, like that will act as fiduciaries and whose fees are not based on getting you into particular investments. But I think there is no harm in asking the question.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate it. I also really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
Ro, I have a question about generational differences. There's some people on the line, like me, who in 10 or 15 years will start to be approaching middle age. And there are other people on the line who are much younger. And we read about generational differences in attitudes and things like that. Do you advise people differently if they're a baby boomer versus a millennial versus a Gen Z? What is your thinking with respect to those issues?
So I think there are some differences just in terms of being in a different stage of life, right? So, making sure that, for instance, if you have kids who are headed to college, making sure that you have plans for that. Or if you are approaching retirement, making sure that you have plans for that. But in terms of the specific advice of like getting your finances on track, I think the advice is the same across the board. I think that we all generally want the same regardless of our generation, right? We want to have control of our money. We want to be able to make decisions based on the things that we think are best for ourselves and our families and not based off of the money. And so that approach, the strategy and all of that is the same, but I do think that there are some different considerations if you're in different stages of life.
You read about all the football players or some of these professional athletes that 5 years after they've left, they have no money left or, not much. And yet they've earned millions and millions over the time. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot to be said for a good night's sleep, isn't there?
Agreed. Yes.
Yeah. When you can sleep because you have your finances in order. More questions from anybody? Yeah. A lot of us are sole practitioners, probably independent mediators, not part of a firm, don't get a paycheck. We have to, from a business, from a company, we pay ourselves. Any special thoughts there? I know, like in the retirement accounts, you can get an individual 401k. And put a lot more money into that, for example, or other types of things that would be particular for solo practitioners, if you will, owners where you're just you.
Yeah. So as I mentioned in the presentation, I don't give like the specific investment advice of like how to set those things up, because that's not my wheelhouse, but I wanted to touch on it because it is important. One thing that I have told, I've had a few clients who are solos, and I encourage them to get a business coach because running your own business is different from getting a paycheck from an employer, right? So the strategies of running that business and making sure that you're bringing in the revenue that you want to and hitting your goals and all of that, I think is going to be different versus someone who is just managing, I get this set amount every month and I'm figuring out how to manage it. So that is the one thing that's different, but otherwise the strategies are the same.
Human strategies. Well, thank you so much. Anybody else? Any other questions before we sign off today? No. Okay, well, you have a lot of wonderful comments here, Rho. Thanks so much for an excellent, thoughtful presentation. Our friend from Hawaii had to leave for another commitment, and he's 3 hours ahead of us here on the West Coast, so he's early. We would just remind everybody about Rho Thomas's preferred food bank, the Atlanta Community Food Bank. And that website is www.acfb.org. And thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Rho, for that fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
See you next Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific. Another wonderful presentation. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Mm.